Hey there. So I got some requests to break down some of the car bomb stuff analytically, and I think I can do that for the intro to Lights Out in a way that's clear and concise and will help you understand what's going on and adapt it to your own playing and composition. So I'm going to start with some simplified examples before looking at the riff itself, and I think that will give you the tools you need to understand the riff much quicker than if we just dived into it directly. So let's say, hypothetically, you're a metal guitar player and you've written a gallop riff. So something like this. So that's a reverse gallop. So roughly speaking, let's say we have 16th notes at some tempo. Spoilers ahead. It's 3 notes and a rest, right? But actually, there's no inherent rule that says those have to be 16th notes. And in fact, without any other context, we can't know for sure if they're 16th notes. So I actually did a video on this a while ago because it really caught my ear. But say, for example, this intro to Katy Perry's I Kissed a Girl. So now we know where Car Bomb's been getting all their stuff. It starts with a gallop in isolation, but then when the drums kick in and the rest of the track, you can hear that actually maybe there's a little bit more going on. Oh, spoilers on the tempo. Okay, so you've written the guitar part, now you're going to write the drum part. So the most common way to do things here is, let's say these are 16th notes. You could put, say, the kick on 1 and 3, snare on 2 and 4, and it would sound something like this. Super straightforward. But the crucial thing to realize here is the only thing we have to follow to make this make a reasonable amount of sense so the wheels don't fall off entirely is as long as it fits this 16th note grid, right? So as long as there's some agreed subdivision that the drums and the guitar and the rest of the track can stick to, everything will kind of work out. So let's say, for example, I was to think, well, what if the gaps between the notes were slightly shorter? So the gaps between the drum beats. Holy shit, it's Katy Perry. Or I could double the tempo by having the gaps between the notes from the original. Right, so that's early Metallica. Or, interestingly, what if I increased the size of the gaps between the notes? Something like this. Right? Or increased it again. Okay, so by now you've probably worked out this is exactly what's happening in Lights Out. So what happens is it starts at the largest possible space between beats, I guess. So we have a note and 5 equivalently sized portions of silence. And then that shrinks, so it gets faster. Then that shrinks again, so it gets faster. And it never reaches going faster again. Oh, sorry, no, it does. It reaches that point. Okay. So notice I said it gets faster, and I threw up the quotes. Basically, does it get faster? It's a matter of perspective, right? So for me personally, when I try and play through this, it's so much easier for me if I focus on it being one tempo all the way through. Okay, so let's look at the structure of Lights Out itself rather than a simplified example. So the first thing you'll notice is the rhythms are a bit more complicated. There are different notes. The notes change. It's got alternating bars of 4/4 and 7/8. Okay, so it's a bit more intimidating. But broadly speaking, it's the same structure. So there's 2 rhythms that you need to be able to play this riff. The first one is the rhythm from Bleed, which I'm sure will surprise very few people. So I'll just slow it down so you can hear it clearly. Right? And I would definitely advise that you get the hang of alternate picked gallops for this. So you would play that down, up. If you haven't done that before, it's super, super weird. And I would take a lot of time to get that up to speed before diving into the rest of the riff. The other rhythm you need to be able to play is the same thing with an additional 2/8 notes. So, and the last note, it's not muted. That's why it sounds different. And that's basically the same thing with an extra downstroke and upstroke at the end. So a good thing to help you keep time for that bit, for example, is that you always play the open, unmuted note on an upstroke. If you're not doing that, something's gone terribly wrong. So let me just play this through for you once so you can kind of hear what it sounds, and if it doesn't sound anything like the riff to you, well, I guess I'm wrong. Oh, I'll play it with the drums. Oh, maybe I'll even play it at full speed. Whew. Okay, so this is kind of fast and intimidating, so don't worry if it scares you, because it scares the shit out of me. So in regards to it sounding like it's getting faster, you can look at the drums here and you can see the pattern I laid out in the simplified example. So we start with 6/16 notes at 112 BPM between each beat, and then that ends up being 5, 4, 3, right? And then we start again with a slight variation on the pattern. So hopefully the tempo changes part of this should now make sense to you. I'll put a link to the tab in the description, and you might even want to just practice it without the drums on, because otherwise it's kind of like when you're trying to do sums and someone is saying random numbers beside you. The drums don't necessarily help you all that much in this track. So yeah, sorry guitar players, you need to have your own sense of time. So then as to the rest of what you need to know to break down this riff, it's actually kind of straightforward. So it climbs chromatically. Basically, in the same way the tempo slowly increases in apparent intensity, the pitch slowly increases in intensity as well. So let's look a little bit more in depth into which patterns they are. So I already explained it's basically the pattern from Bleed and a pattern that's 2 notes longer than that. So you start with the one that's 2 notes longer, and the last note you play without palm muting. So when you play that together, it sounds like this. Second pattern, it's exactly the same rhythmic pattern as Bleed, but there's a little thing that happens with the note grouping. So the first time you play, the pattern from Bleed is technically called a herta, so I'll call it a herta from now on. So you play 2 hertas, the second which ends in a note that's 1 semitone lower, like this. Then you play 3 hertas with the last note lower. And again, 3 with the last one lower. And then there's a little tail here to make it end in time. The third pattern is basically the same as the second, but up a semitone. So all of this, copy and paste, all of this, up 1 fret. Finally, the last pattern, it's actually the same as the first pattern, except it's up 4 frets. So that sounds like this. And then this here, live they seem to use some kind of whammy pedal for the noise or something. I used a pinch harmonic and just kind of fluked it. Okay, so now you've learned the rhythms from the first half, you'll be pleased to hear it's exactly the same rhythms for the second half. So all of this matches all of this, with tiny exception. So to add additional musical interest, there's also some melodic leaps added as well. So now we have, instead of the first pattern, which was pretty vanilla and it sounded like this, what happens is every other time it starts with a string skip note. So it sounds like this. So I personally find it easier to hybrid pick that. Depending on your personal style, you might find it easier to alternate pick. I think the guitarist from Car Bomb actually just alternate picks the whole thing, which I just couldn't do. Okay, so the second string skipping pattern, it's kind of awkward any way I can think to describe of, but it's not actually that complicated. So you start with 2 hertas, and you start with 1 octave displaced note that's high and 1 note that's chromatically low, like this. And then the next 2 times, it's a herta, an octave displaced note an octave higher, as part of 2 hertas, and then a note that's chromatically lower. So basically, 1 of this, 2 of this. So it's still the same rhythmic structure, and in some ways the same structure as the initial one, just a little bit more complicated. Finally, this one, I basically just had to vibe it and work it out by ear as best I could. Again, we kind of have these octave displaced notes. I think it does go down 1 tone chromatically lower for this note beforehand. So now this pattern sounds like this. And again, this one I just kind of had to vibe to some extent because the drums continue playing the same rhythm as before, but I don't think you can fit in a 30-second note gallop in there. If maybe Car Bomb can. I can't quite hear it, and I certainly couldn't physically do it, but it sounds like this. Whew. And then the horrifying thing for me is that doesn't actually match up with the rhythmic. It doesn't actually match up perfectly with the metric modulation in the drums. So if you listen to those octave displaced notes, the string skips, they don't necessarily fall where the drum hits are. Oh, if I turn on the drums up, might make it make more sense. Okay, so obviously this is not particularly easy music, and it will take you a lot of practice just to nail the physical portion of this and more to nail the mental portion of this. But I do believe that you can take that initial idea of the simplified version where we explored how you could take the same framework of 16th notes and make it sound like it's many different tempos. And of course, with practice, you can do this with more advanced subdivisions as well. So you can take something that starts out as sounding like quintuplets in one tempo and make it 16th notes in another tempo, right? Rather than starting at the 16th. I hope this was fun.